as we mourn the loss of Hirsch and the other 5 Kedoshim that were murdered by our enemies just days ago, along with the 1,200 of our brothers and sisters taken from us on October 7th, I am moved in multiple directions. As we all say goodbye to our fellow Richmonder in KBI or Hirsch Goldberg, Poland, we must take the proper time to channel our grief and anger into change. When a family member dies of natural causes at a normal age, we strive to keep that family member alive in our minds and hearts. We say Kaddish on every yard site. We give tzedakah, charity, on their behalf. And we tell endless stories rekindling the memories of our lost ones in our own minds. But the loss of innocent civilians taken before their time and the loss of our precious IDF soldiers defending against a brutal and thoughtless enemy is an added responsibility for all of us. We must use the memories of our latest victims to effect change. In the late 1980s, Jews worldwide gathered weekly in synagogue demanding that the evil Soviet regime allow our Jewish brethren to leave the former Soviet Union and emigrate to Israel. After years of weekly sermons, speeches, marches, op-eds, and significant pressure on our elected officials, the miracle happened. In 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev shifted oppressive policy and permitted nearly 1.6 million Jews to leave Russia. We here in America and in Europe were not personally affected by Soviet anti-Semitism, but we stood up for our fellow Jews and shone the spotlight on evil policy that discriminated against Soviet Jewry. We were the catalyst. We were the cause that affected change. Elected officials all throughout the world were focused on this issue. They interviewed on television, on radio, in newspapers and journals. We marched 300,000 proud on Washington, D.C., many of us from Richmond led by our former Rav, Charles Lipschitz. We refused to allow the Soviets to lie about the Jews of Russia and stifling, suffocating policies that held our people down. We even did our part in convincing a president in June of 1987 to insist that the Soviets tear down this wall. We made our voices heard, spreading the truth and forcing our message of truth on the entire world. My family, it is that time again. We must represent Hirsch and all of those who have succumbed to lies, the hatred, the anti-Semitism that is now spread all over the world. In our own towns and cities, in our own America, Jews are no longer protected. Our college campuses are breeding grounds for inaccurate and hateful propaganda that is teaching our neighbors to hate us, to expel us, and to kill us. The time has arrived for all of us to march, to write in, to provide interviews, to pressure elected officials to simply listen to the truth and not be swayed by hate-filled falsehoods that are only meant to divide. I offer you now my own example of how we might convince our neighbors with truth and common sense. Some 3,350 years past, one of the most celebrated biblical miracles occurred just miles away from the current conflict in Gaza. Nearly 3.5 millennia ago, the Jewish people suffered as slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. For hundreds of years, the Jews forcibly served the mightiest leader of the world. This tyrant denied their basic human rights and subjected them to the very worst human atrocities. The God of the Israelites selected the most humble of all Jews and the greatest of all prophets, Moses, to lead them out of slavery. Moses brought God's message directly to Pharaoh. Let my people go. The stubborn Egyptian leader refused this order, and up until the last of the 10 plagues, the killing of all the firstborn in Egypt. Being that the Jews also lived in Egypt, Moses instructed them to smear the blood of a lamb on their doorposts, so the angel of death might pass over the houses of the Jewish firstborns, while the Egyptian firstborns would perish. This Passover was the final blow to Pharaoh, who lost his firstborn son to the plague. As they say, the rest is history. Moses led the Jews through the Red Sea, chased by the evil Pharaoh. The next chapter of this incredible story is highly relevant to the perilous time we are now living through. Moses' mission was not only to free the Jewish people from bitter bondage, but to lead them to the land promised to Abraham, our father, the father of the Jewish people, and a prophet revered by both Christians and Muslims. God himself had given this promised land, the land of Israel, flowing with milk and honey, directly to the people who would descend from Abraham. After 40 years of wandering, these Jewish people entered the holiest of lands, and along with our Torah, the Bible, they had received on their journey, they became a nation, one that the Master of the universe had chosen to be a shining light unto the peoples of the world. A Jewish nation that would still suffer under a multitude of enemies, but a nation that would live for eternity inside its promised land. We read in the Haggadah, the written account of Passover, that in every generation they rise to annihilate us, but the Holy One, blessed is he, rescues us from their hand. The October 7th massacre, in which Hamas savagely murdered over 1,200 Jews, is yet another example of our enemies attempting to annihilate us. While the world protests against the Jewish response to this atrocious aggression, it is up to reasonable minds to explain and deliver the truth. In 2005, when Israel unilaterally withdrew from Gaza, a de facto two-state solution was at hand. The Palestinians had a new opportunity to govern themselves as they so demanded, yet they chose the terrorist group Hamas to represent them. From that fated day in August of 2005, as Israel dismantled settlements in Gaza, the Palestinians immediately began firing rockets. Why, you might ask, would the newly liberated Gazan leadership attack Israel after Israel had withdrawn? Because even before the Hamas-led government stepped into power, the Palestinians had already made their desires clear. They had and continue to have no desire for a two-state solution. They want all of the land from the river to the sea, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, free of Jews. They want this tiny strip of land for themselves as one Palestinian state, with no regard for the United Nations 1947 resolution that offered them half of this land, while half would go to the Jews. They rejected the UN Compromise of 1947. They rejected the birth of modern Israel in 1948, and they joined with neighboring states in 1948, 56, 67, and 73 to war against the Jews. Never mind that 193 member nations within the United Nations, 56 of whom are from predominantly Muslim countries. With nearly 2 billion Muslims in the world out of a population of about 8 million, 56 Muslim countries seems proportionate. Why then has there always been and continues to be such revulsion, antagonism, and resistance to just one Jewish state? One Jewish state promised by the God of the Jews as well as the God of the Christians and the Muslims. The stench of anti-Semitism is once again blowing across the world. History records that Jews have been forced to leave every country they've ever lived in. Still, who could have imagined that here in America there would be calls for death and expulsion of Jews? It's happening all over our college campuses and our streets, and shockingly even in the halls of Congress. While it is clear to most that the rational arguments presented by the haters are hollow and without fact, their efforts are protected and they continue to grow. What can we do to help the world understand the truth about the current plight of the Jews in Israel and around the world? We must go back and re-explain the history of the Jewish people. We were chosen by God to manifest His holiness, His goodness, His fairness, and His love for all people and the entire world. Jews as a people were born out of slavery and formed a nation destined to dwell in the land that flows with milk and honey, the land of Israel. This land, with its holy capital of Jerusalem, referred to in Jewish prayer as Zion. It's the eternal homeland of the Jewish people. Just as the Jewish world respects the sovereignty of the Muslim nations and all nations of the world, we expect the same for our tiny Israel. Mighty enemies have risen to annihilate the Jews, among them the Roman Empire, the Greeks, the vile and hateful Nazi regime, and now the Palestinians. Wake up, enemies of Israel. The Jewish people and the Jewish nation, respect your people and your lands. Take this example and tell that to your children. Tell them the truth. And remember, in every generation, they will rise up to annihilate the Jews, but the Holy One, blessed is He, rescues us from your hand.